South East Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.
South East Radio.
Whilst the world of HR has always evolved at a fast pace, in recent months we have seen moves to introduce a right to remote working, statutory sick pay entitlements, as well as an ongoing intention to implement auto-enrollment pensions. When considered against the backdrop of severe staff shortages in certain sectors, it can be a lot for an employer to get their head around. My first guest, Damien McCarthy from HR Buddy, joins me now to discuss these recent developments. Damien, let's start by discussing the revised Return to Work protocol. What changes were made to this document recently?
Yes, Carl. Well, I suppose, first of all, it was very welcome when employees were allowed to be phased back into the workplace. I suppose initially a lot of celebration and excitement. But most certainly, in particular, I think, Carol, in the first week or two, when employees were returning to the workplace, there seemed to be an awful lot of confusion. And I suppose we did have to wait a week or two before the transitional protocol was actually released. But I suppose since the transitional protocol has been released, it now provides much better guidance to employers on how they should operate their activities in the return to work. And I suppose the transitional protocol is an evolution of the Work Safely protocol. So I suppose to give like a few very obvious little bits of clarity on that, employees no longer need to work from home. They can be phased back into the workplace. There is no requirement to maintain 2 meters physical distancing in the workplace. And there's also no requirement to operate in pods of 6. And you do not need to collect the contact details of people on the premises. And there did seem to be an awful lot of questions and queries with regards to the wearing of face masks in the workplace as well originally. And I suppose the transition protocol has given guidance on that as well and clarity on that, whereby face masks are only required in certain settings such as healthcare, transport, retail and public offices, and by those serving food and drink. But the protocol does still say that wearing face masks is still good practice, especially for those sharing work vehicles. So most certainly there has been some clarity, and that is avoiding a lot of confusion that we did see within the first week or two of people returning to work.
And of course, just at the end of January there, the Taoiseach published the details of the new right to request remote working. That has caused a little bit of a stir since then, hasn't it?
Well, yes, it has. I suppose there's an awful lot going on for employers at the moment. They're working their way out of a pandemic, and I suppose it's a very tricky environment, and I suppose a lot of employers feel that an awful lot of changes in legislation is being thrown at them at the moment. But this legislation is part of a commitment to the EU Work-Life Balance Directive. So it was something that we were expecting to see. I suppose it's not going to be finalised into law until July at the earliest. But the announcement a few weeks ago gave us some detail on what that legislation might look like. Okay, so the employees will have the right to request remote working. I suppose what's important now for employers is that they develop their remote working policy, because that is actually going to be a legal requirement. And indeed there will be a fine of €2,500 if you aren't able to produce your remote working policy. But what I would say to employers is that it is now very important that if they haven't already begun work on the remote working policy, that they should. And they should explore what is going to work from the point of view of remote working requests being made or hybrid working requests being made, and what is going to make sense for their business going forward. But I would also say that once this right to request remote working is signed into law in July or sometime afterwards, more than likely we are still going to see some amendments made, because there is an awful lot of, I suppose, legal argument at the moment, and very definitely, I suppose, legal arguments around things like insurance and health and safety and things like that with regards to remote working. So not a straightforward piece of legislation by any means.
Something that I often feel may be overlooked by employers when they are granting remote work is that the remote workspace automatically becomes an extension of the office. So what can employers do to protect them in that respect?
Well, I suppose with regards to employment law and health and safety law, Carl, the employer needs to ensure that the employee is provided with a workstation, so a work desk and so on, and that an ergonomic and risk assessment has been carried out on that workspace. I suppose with regards health and safety, and indeed insurance and things like that, there are still an awful lot of questions. And when the employer is preparing the remote working policy, most certainly they should be liaising with HR expertise, employment law expertise, health and safety expertise, and indeed, with regards to their insurance policies and so on, because there has been cases internationally whereby home workers have, tripped and fallen down their stairs during work hours and actually taken a case against the employer and won. So again, going back to the remote working policy, this needs to be very carefully drafted, very well considered and tailored document from the employer's point of view, in particular in regard to things like health and safety.
Another area that's emerging as well is this whole area of statutory sick pay. The legislation is pending in relation to that. What's that going to mean for employers?
Yes, Karen. Well, in the next few weeks, sometime soon, we should see the final draft be signed into law with regards to the statutory sick pay scheme. Now, the Oireachtas Committee on Enterprise, Trade and Employment have approved this, so we will expect it to be signed into law sometime soon. I suppose, just to mention, there are two recommendations made by the committee on this previous to, I suppose, some of the information that might have been released back in 2021. One is that, in particular, lower paid workers may have some right for some type of rebate for the medical sort that needs to be produced to the employer as part of getting the statutory sick pay. And the other one is that they also recommended that an employer, if they could demonstrate to the Labour Court that they couldn't genuinely afford to make the payment with regards to sick pay scheme, would be able to do so. So I suppose we're still awaiting final detail on it, but what we do know is that in 2022, statutory sick pay is going to start being phased in when it's signed into law. That's going to go up to 5 days in 2023, 7 days in 2024, and eventually 10 days of statutory sick pay in 2025. Every employee will be entitled to that as long as they have 13 weeks service with their current employer.
Another cost is coming down the track at businesses. We don't know exactly when, but it's certainly coming, and that's auto-enrollment pensions. So what's the latest on that, Damien?
Yeah, well, it had been touted that we would see this legislation in 2022. Now, I would be very doubtful about that. If you look at the remote working legislation, we were promised that in quarter 3 of 2021. But with regards pension auto enrolment, it's in place across many European countries already. It's in place in the UK. It is most definitely something that we are going to see here. Obviously, as a state, we have problems with regards securing our future and the future of current workers with regards to pensions. So the idea is that employees would be auto-enrolled, and if they wanted to be removed from the workplace pension, that they would have to make a request in writing. So it's almost flipping it around on the current situation whereby an employee would have to request from their employer that a pension would be provided through the employer's payroll as it currently stands, in that it's going to be flipped around, and an employee would automatically be put on a pension scheme, and they would have to request in writing for them to be taken off it if they wish so.
The employer has to contribute to that as well.
Again, it has been touted that the employer will contribute. Now, I do think, Carl, that that it is still down the tracks a little bit, and like the right to request remote working legislation, I think there may be an awful lot of debate on that coming up. Perhaps in the second half of this year. I suppose employers are having an awful lot of costs being put on them, and most certainly feedback coming from employers is that new legislation keeps on getting put on their desk, and they're the ones having to pay for it. And if you look at the statutory sick pay scheme and I suppose the extra public holiday entitlement, which is now coming in also on March the 18th from this year, and indeed on St. Bridget's Day from next year onwards. That's even 4 days alone in 2022, and by 2025 that's 11 days. That actually adds 3% to every employee's payroll cost for their employer. So there's a lot of cost we put on employers, and I still think there's going to be an awful lot of debate before we see pension auto enrollment being signed into legislation.
Of course, one of the other major challenges facing employers across the country is staff shortages. One possible solution for many sectors is an increase in work permits to be able to bring staff in from outside of Europe. What are your thoughts on this, and what progress do you think we're going to see this year in that respect?
Yes, well, very definitely across some sectors in particular, more so than others. I mean, the hospitality industry is very definitely in crisis at the moment with regard to staffing shortages. And I suppose the hospitality sector was looking towards foreign workers previous to the pandemic, never mind in 2022. And indeed across construction, many other industries now, there are staffing issues. I suppose, looking abroad may be an answer, but it's problematic from an administration point of view. There's also a cost to it. It can be a very slow process. So most certainly for sectors that are experiencing staffing shortages, I think something maybe needs to be done at a government level to make that process easier, quicker and smarter and more efficient.
And Damien, finally, employee retention has never been as important for businesses across the country. So what advice have you got for employers in that regard?
If you look at it, Carl, it's a competition across the industries between employers, and most certainly it's a very hard and challenging market as regards recruitment and retention. Everything is going in the employees' direction at the moment. But what I would say to employers is, try and get an edge. If you're developing a remote working policy at the moment, try and have it well tailored. Try and develop a policy that is going to seem attractive to possible future candidates and recruits. I very definitely think the future of work is moving towards life-work balance and flexible working. Not every employer might like to hear that, but in particular, if you look at the challenges now with regards to the cost of living crisis and so on, there are obvious transport costs, there are fuel costs and so on in commuting. There are childcare costs is a huge issue. I suppose if you looked at flexible working and if you were able to decrease childcare and fuel costs for your worker, you may become a more attractive employer.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Damien McCarthy from HR Buddy, and I'd like to thank Damien for keeping us up to date with recent developments in the world of HR.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.